Bonjour, Kinamagi Nene Ireland Indigenicast coming live with this episode of Social Studies Television. Today's episode, Chapter 4, Lesson 6, Class in the Colonies. As we get into this assignment, there will be conversations about some things that are not amongst the highlights of American history, including slavery, racism, and other topics that might invoke an emotional reaction. You may see antiquated words, such as what's appearing on this page, that are used in common and polite conversation today, but is a relic of the terminology used at the period that we are discussing. Our essential questions are the same as they have been in this chapter. Vocabulary, we talk about class. In this case, we're not talking about social studies class or the fifth grade class. We're talking about the stratus of where people were grouped together as far as a social hierarchy. Merchants are people that sell things, like a store owner. Apprentices are people that learn a skill from someone who already has a good reputation on doing something, like a blacksmith. You'd have to be an apprentice at a blacksmith shop, so you learn the skill and how to do the job. And then after a set amount of time, you go out and you do it on your own. All right, beginning today with slaves. You are currently studying a time in history when slavery was allowed and used in all the British colonies. Many slaves had to work in the fields from sun up to sundown, and they only got Sunday off. This was especially true of Southern slaves because the weather was nice enough to work nearly year-round. It was very difficult work, and they were often treated poorly. Slaves were considered the lowest class of the population living in the colonies. Some slaves did have the opportunity to work as house servants. These slaves worked on household duties, serving the plantation owner's family rather than work in the fields. They did jobs like cooking, laundry, coopers, blacksmith, and other skilled jobs. While they were still slaves, these slaves were considered a slightly higher class than slaves who worked in the fields. And they will make up the base of our pyramid in just a little bit. The next category up would be free blacks, also known as freedmen. Some Africans managed to buy their freedom. However, the number of free blacks in the colonies was very low. It took a lot of effort to earn one's freedom, and very few accomplished it. Though these people did not have the same rights as the white people around them, their lives were somewhat better than enslaved blacks. They were allowed to buy property. They also held jobs that required some level of skill and were allowed to participate in the community. Now moving up the ladder, farmers. Even though the majority of the colonists were farmers, it was considered a lower working class. Most farmers worked with their own families, parents, and any children they had. Occasionally, a farmer might hire a person or purchase one or two slaves to help them. This was fairly rare. Next level up, middlings. As the colonies matured, a new class started to rise. This group was called the middlings. Like their name suggests, they were the middle class. People in this group tended to work at some sort of trade. They learned to do skilled work like blacksmiths, silversmiths, and printers. They also educated for professional jobs like lawyers, doctors, and merchants. People in these positions often started their training at a young age. They would start off as apprentices and train with a skilled worker. They worked very long hours, sometimes more than 12 hours a day. Even though the training was hard, the reward was great. It was the only way to attain one of the careers that led to a lifestyle other than farming. And at the peak of our pyramid, the gentry was the highest class in the colonies. They were also very wealthy. Most were large landowners, financial businessmen, or successful merchants. These men owned several slaves as well. These men, commonly called gentlemen, thought it was their job to govern others. They would serve as churchmen, councilmen, and local judges. Ladies of the gentry, or gentlewomen, were often seen as the height of society. They were at the top of their social class and were often up to date on fashion and manners. So let's look at this pyramid of social class. At the bottom, we have slaves. And I'm not going to differentiate between house workers and field workers at this time. Now we have freedmen or free blacks. Just as a reminder, these people in this category had some freedom in the fact that they weren't tied to a plantation. They could have jobs. They could move their way up socially into one of the next two categories, but they were never given the full benefits of citizenship. They weren't going to be, in most cases, eligible to be part of the gentry. It's not the best spot for anybody. Next up, we have farmers. And the farmers are going to be, in a lot of cases, poor Caucasians, but also some of the freedmen that had moved up a little bit in the social class. Then we have middlings, or the middle class. It was the goal of farmers and freedmen to move their way into the middlings, as some would. And at the peak of our social hierarchy was the gentry, the people who believed that, they were in charge of everything. The goal of people in the middlings and farmers was eventually to earn their way up into gentry, but in many cases, part of this was aristocratic by birth, good fortune of having an inheritance, or some other factor that was generally beyond one's own control. And when we see people grouped together like this in the 21st century, we kind of look and say, why would we do this? But it is something that still exists, and not necessarily with slaves and freedmen and farmers and middlings and gentry. We have new titles and new groups, but people are quite often grouped together. This is in no way an endorsement of such a system, but an acknowledgement that a system does exist. Hopefully you learned a little bit about class in the in the colonies. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out at mireland@psychchipschool.net. Just a reminder that the best place to engage in these lessons is during class time. So we look forward to seeing you back in class soon. Hope you all had a Minogijigat. Bamapi.